Welcome, gentle reader, for this unusually cool episode of Everything is Everything, where Amit has promised to tell us stories about stories. Amit, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I love the I love the way that you just told our gentle readers a story about the episode before it has even taken place. I love the optimism, but like any good storyteller, you're kind of planning ahead. Now, I've always been fascinated by the act of storytelling because it's ingrained into us. It is, I would say, the first human instinct. The world is deeply complex. How do we make sense of a complicated world? We tell stories about it. Imagine yourself in prehistoric times without clothes, without cell phones and the internet, and this bright orange object in the sky rises and falls, rises and falls, rises and falls. You don't know what the hell is going on. What do? You make up a story about it. And thus you have sun gods, and thus you have the beginning of religion. And all our ways of comprehending the world come from stories. Over time, our stories get better and better. Some of them, even shock horror, begin to correspond to actual reality. But ultimately, every story is a simplification. And yet, the instinct of storytelling is like a necessary act. Otherwise, we would just be, bokla gaya, what's going on. Everything would, seem unfathomable, and we would be paralyzed into inaction. And this plays its way through human storytelling. Like, one thing I've never really completely figured out or grokked every aspect of is, fine, we tell stories. Why do we tell the stories that we do? And it might seem that we tell an infinite number of stories, but it is postulated by some people that there are a finite number of actual storylines, and we just fit everything into that. So, many years back, I read this excellent book by Christopher Booker called The Seven Basic Plots. And his funda was this, that there are seven plots, which we will talk about in this episode, and all stories fit into that, right? So, if you look at Beowulf and the Epic of Gilgamesh, you look at Jaws and the James Bond films, and you look at Sholay, they're all basically the same story. They might seem completely different, but you've changed settings, you've changed characters, you've changed chota mota bits, but they're basically the same structure. And I find this interesting just in terms of thinking about, okay, what are these structures and why these structures? Why have they been so persistent, and why have they appealed so much to us? So that's what I want to talk about today.
I want to just talk a little around storytelling. Uh, you correctly mixed up a scientific quest and our, amusement quest around stories, because actually to be human is to have both. Okay, we are not robots, we are not computers, we are not LLMs, we are human. And we simultaneously bring that distinctively human ability to look at the world and sometimes theorize in more formal ways, but those are also stories. Or tell ourselves stories which are a spectrum of how fanciful and how connected to reality. And, one should just embrace oneself and, be in touch with our base urges and tell stories. So, Amit, tell us types of stories.
So before we get into types of stories, some thoughts about the commonalities that there are, and I'll actually quote Booker himself from his book as to how he came upon this realization that there are a finite number of stories and certain threads run through different stories. So there was a point in time where he was reading a bunch of books simultaneously, which included Macbeth, which included Lolita, which he was watching. He watched Truffaut's film Jules Legime. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Jules Legime, and he noticed that there was a sort of a similar arc running through them, or in other words, basically the same thing was happening. So let me read out what he wrote about that. Each begins with a hero or heroes in some way unfulfilled. The mood at the beginning of the story is one of anticipation, as a hero seems to be standing on the edge of some great adventure or experience. In each case, he finds a focus for his ambitions or desires, and for a time seems to enjoy almost dreamlike success. Macbeth becomes king. Humbert embarks on his affair with the bewitching Lolita. Jules Legime, two young men in the pre-First World War Paris meet the girl of their dreams. Icarus discovers that he can fly. Faust is given access by the devil to all kinds of magical experiences. But gradually, the mood of the story darkens. The hero experiences an increasing sense of frustration. There is something about the course he has chosen which makes it appear doomed, unable to resolve happily. More and more he runs into difficulty, everything goes wrong, until the original dream has turned into a nightmare. Finally, seemingly inexorably, the story works up to a climax of violent self-destruction. The dream ends in death. And this is also common to Romeo and Juliet, Madame Bovary, a bunch of other works. I mean, it would have sounded familiar to you. And the interesting thing is, not only do you have these certain types of stories, archetypal stories, as it were, that keep recurring, but you also have certain types of structure within the storytelling which make them more effective. If any of our viewers live in Warsaw, then no doubt they have tried writing screenplays. And so you would know of Sid Field's three-act structure, where you have a setup, and then you have a grand conflict, and then you have a resolution, and that's that structure. The five-act structure is commonly spoken of. Each of the tropes I will describe, the story types, the archetypes, have different five-act structures, but they're all five, so it's interesting, and there are various kinds of structural things that you can do with them. But in a sense, it's all, you start in a quiet place, and then shit happens, and then you end in a quiet place, and the end can be death, or the end can be happiness, or whatever. So the structures are common. But one thing I'd like to say at the outset is that, dear readers, I'm not being prescriptive. If you're writers, if you're storytellers, I'm not telling you that, these are all the 7 plots you have available to you. Isme jo karna hai karo. Number one, I'm not saying that, modern literature and modern cinema even goes beyond these. Many different things happens. You got to follow your heart and go into whatever directions you feel like. And secondly, even if you realize that the story you want to tell happens to fall within one or more of those framework, and if you look at great works like, say, Lord of the Rings or Mahabharata, they actually have all 7 tropes in them. But even if you, find yourself working within one of them, it's not a constraint. It's a structure. And within that structure, you can just do so many creative things, and you can be wildly different from everything that has been done before.
So I wonder whether there is a LLM prompt engineering idea here, that around each of the 7 stories, can there be like a 1,000-word prompt, and then you do the trivial details like supplying Romeo and Juliet, and you mass produce fiction. Okay, so then this could be a more dreary way to exploit this, but that's absolutely not where you are. You're not suggesting a normative message to the writer saying you should go down this route, though undoubtedly a lot of rubbish writing is being done using LLMs these days. But I want to go off into a completely different field, where in fact there is a rough analogy to a finite number of styles, if I may, and these are then pushed as a normative claim. And this is the world of Indian classical music. Okay, so in the world of Indian classical music, their music theory, so to speak, like the music theory in Indian classical music is different from Western classical music. In Indian classical music, music theory is oriented around the raga, and the raga is a list of rules which must be followed when you are inside one story type, one song type. And there comes a normative claim that you go down this route and your songs will be better. So they're not taking a universe of songs and saying, you know what, they all fit 7 types. They are in fact going one step further. They're saying, you're welcome to make up songs from your imagination, but if you will constrain your imagination into Rag Bhairavi, then you will actually end up with more beautiful songs. So it's a very interesting and a different take on something that is kind of reminiscent of this.
And I want to say 2 things here. One is that don't diss LLMs, right? The process that you just described, that it turns out a templatized thing and you shift the name, is basically what has been happening throughout the history of literature. Sturgeon's law says that 95% of everything is scrap. Mediocre writers or writers without the courage to seek their own path will, work within a will use a formula, so to say. And sadly, many filmmakers will complain about film executives at studios who are also trying to force these formulas upon them. But the interesting thing here is that the way to break out of mediocrity is not to break out of the structure. It is to do interesting things within the structure and make it work for you. And the second thing I wonder about is that why are those ragas what they are? Right? Why does a particular raga make you sad? Why does a particular way of arranging a sequence of notes make you happy? Why does a particular set of beats make you dance? It eventually comes back to how we are wired, right? There is no objectively good or bad. Other animals might react differently, but the way our brains are wired, a certain set of notes may make us feel a certain way when they are played in a particular manner. And I think it's the same thing with stories, that these archetypal stories, they speak to something deep within us. Maybe it is the urge to escape our confined worlds. Maybe it is the urge to find love. maybe it is the thirst for adventure, or whatever it is. But all of them speak to something fundamental within us. And I don't think anyone has really gone deeper within that to actually, map it out completely. We don't yet understand human nature well enough. But, it's just so fascinating.
Gentle reader, here's a research idea for people who work with movies and data, which I don't. So imagine you take a random sample of 100 Malayalam movies. Then you classify each of them into the 7 types and then start computing means and variances of what stories work with the audiences.
I mean, it's entirely possible, but the point is, people intuitively kind of see it's not that a structure will work and it's not that an archetype will work. Ultimately, it is the beautiful things you do within the structure and within the archetype that
No,
work.
I'm going all movie executive on you.
Yeah,
So
don't.
if the risk and reward of the 7 types are different, then we shall constrain the screenwriter saying, no, dude, you're going to go down line of attack number 2.
I am the artist. And as you can see from the way we are dressed, I am the artist, he's the suit. Though you're not wearing a suit, but it's close enough.
Yeah, I'm the
Shame on
finance
you.
guy.
You're the finance guy.
Amit, get us started with the first story type.
So the first archetype is overcoming the Indian state.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm kidding. It's obviously, as you would have guessed by now, overcoming the monster, right? And this is something you find in the older stories, Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf. It's something that runs through Hollywood, whether you look at all the James Bond films, Dr. No, etc. You look at Jaws, right? In his book, Booker draws a comparison between Beowulf and Jaws, and they're basically the same story, right? And in Star Wars is exactly that template. And in an Indian context, you will find that there is like Sholay, Ghajini, and Krish, and so on, which is about overcoming a monster, either a human embodiment or a literal monster like in Jurassic Park or King Kong, and etc. etc. So the arc of the story is things are normal, there's a monster, and then you got to beat the monster, and shit's going down badly. But eventually, guess what? We win, unless that monster is the Indian state. I don't think that film has been written yet.
If the story ends as we lose, then it's not this story type.
It could be the story type. See, multiple story types can merge. If we lose, then it's another story type tragedy, which comes at the end. So these are like different story types can merge into one another. Lord of the Rings is a mix of all of these story types, and in that also you're fighting a big monster and the monster dies. Similarly with Harry Potter, but there are also other kind of arcs in them.
So in our episodes of stories that ought to be films, at one point we had done the Battle of Kiev. Okay, that's a pure, simple, fits the story type.
Overcoming the monster.
Things are fine in Ukraine, a monster comes along and invades from the north, and at first it seems as all is lost. There would be footage about how every bloke in the world treats it as a done deal. It's only a question of when Ukraine will be conquered, not whether, and myself included. But the scrappy Ukrainians, they get their shit together, and armed with amazing artillery and javelin missiles, they stop the monster in his tracks.
I am going to buy a kurta and a patiala for you because there is an artist in you. And what you have just described is actually the classic 5-act structure for overcoming the monster film. So let me just read that out and you'll see it on the screen as well. And that 5-act structure is, and this is common to all the James Bond films, the call, initial success, confrontation, final ordeal, miraculous escape. Right? And the call is really, people are chilling in Ukraine, perhaps. Zelensky is hanging out in his office. Everything looks normal. And then suddenly something happens. But there is initial success. The Russians don't take over all of Ukraine and think, it's okay. And then there is a pitched battle. And then there is a moment, and perhaps that moment is now, or, if Trump wins the elections, there is a moment where it seems, oh my God, we are going to hell. And then eventually the monster is defeated. Unfortunately, we are in the real world. We don't know whether...
We don't yet know. It's story type 1 or story type 5.
Yeah, I mean, it could end in tragedy, but right now, let us hope that it is a matter of overcoming the monster. Type 2, let me begin with a quiz question for you. What is common to Sylvester Stallone, Julia Roberts, Anne Hathaway, and Ranbir Kapoor?
Sylvester Stallone, I remember you told me a story that he wrote Rocky.
You're very close. He did write Rocky and he wanted to act in it, and they said, no, we'll buy the script, we'll give you a lot of
he stood
money.
his
And he said,
ground,
fuck you, I want to
and
act in it.
everything
And
worked.
yeah, that's quite brilliant. And Rocky is an example I'm coming with because your second sort of archetype is rags to riches, right? My life sadly only rags. I hope you've gotten to riches or will at some point. Rags to riches. And as the name indicates, your main character starts off in a place that is not very good, and they get better and better, and everything works out. So it's Stallone in Rocky, it's Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, Anne Hathaway in The Devil Wears Prada, is Ranbir Kapoor in Rockstar, and long before all of these people, it is Cinderella, it is Aladdin, So it's a trope that has like come forever, and it's a trope everybody can, I think, identify with, because most people imagine, most people dream of being better off, much better off. So it's really appealing to watch a story where there is somebody whose circumstances aren't that great, but hey, they made it out, you can make it out. It's a beautiful, vicarious sort of.
Well, my father's story.
Tell me about your father's story.
He started from the bottom. He was in a village in Hyderabad, Sindh, in what is now Pakistan, and there was just nothing around there. And from there, he ended up as one of the cool economists of the country, and he founded CMIE, and all in a short 58 years.
And it's such a beautiful story. And I think your father's story is rags to riches, but your story, will it be tragedy? Are you going to let him down?
Riches to rags.
Riches to rags, perhaps. Well done. And even here, there is a structure. And again, these 5-act structures keep coming up. Booker comes up with them. I would just like to tell gentle readers, this is one book which we are chatting about. These are 7 plots. You could come up with more. You could compress a couple of these into one. That's all up to you. It's just an interesting way to think about stuff. And what I would also like all our readers to do is that, as you sort of watch this episode, if you think of films that fit, books that fit, put it down there in the comments and make it a challenge upon yourself to come up with names that no one else in the comments has yet done. Is that right?
Tell me the 5-act structure for this one.
I'll tell you the 5-act structure, and then you have to immediately identify something that fits. So it begins with wretchedness at home, or the call, like Cinderella and whatever. Then you go out in the world and there's initial success. But then the 3rd act is there is a crisis, and that's at the heart of the story. And then the 4th act is there is a final ordeal, which perhaps leads to independence. And the 5th act is final union, which is basically, in Cinderella's case, the prince saying, hey, this is awesome.
It's not rags to riches. I mean, it's union, not riches, meaning it.
I mean,
it
in
is
Cinderella's case, she becomes a princess.
Yeah,
so it is.
Okay, yeah, kind of.
She gets to her kind of riches. Do you have any story in mind like this?
I mean, I'll have to hunt.
Or a young PhD student becomes finance minister. In a sense, you could say, hey, Manmohan Singh is rags to riches. See, it fits.
Very unexpected beginnings, and just, chipped away and ended up at the top of the game through many trials and tribulations. And as he said correctly, history will judge me more kindly than you guys are.
I judge him very, very kindly. I don't think history can judge him more kindly.
At 2012, 13,
around that
the
time.
way he was being reviled.
Yeah, yeah. And you could also argue that, we spoke about overcoming the monster in the last chapter, and you could argue that some leaders actually became monsters. Yeah. But that also
that's
fits
a
into
different story type.
That's a tragedy story type.
Yeah. Yes, Amit, tell us number 3.
Are you searching for number 3? Are you on a quest to find number 3? Number 3 is a quest. Okay. And, as the name indicates, you're searching for something, you go on a journey. It is a journey to find something, and eventually you find it. And this is, again, the oldest archetype in many ways. Odyssey, Pilgrim's Progress, the Divine Comedy, they're all kind of centered around this, and you get this.
Does Lord of the Rings count?
Lord of the Rings
my quest is to throw away a ring into the volcano.
Absolutely. Lord of the Rings, like we said, includes all 7 of these types. So Lord of the Rings absolutely counts. Raiders of the Lost Ark counts. Finding Nemo counts. And so on and so forth. I mean, it can be endless. I think Bollywood films, Chennai Express, and I mean, practically, half the films that become hits have some kind of quest at the heart of it. And yeah,
does the quest to discover a nuclear bomb count? Then it's a Manhattan Project.
I think it absolutely counts. I think when you speak of Oppenheimer, it is also tragedy, a trope that we will come back to. I'm very good at identifying tragedy. You see?
Okay.
So
No, the world is filled with tragedy.
the world is filled with tragedy, and also I think my gaze is filled with tragedy, but it is what it is. But yeah, so
Yeah.
and
A while ago, I had talked about a book, Soul of a New Machine by Tracy Kidder. It's a journalist that got embedded deep inside the journey in a company called Data General, which built one CPU. Okay, so it's a bunch of guys. Their quest is they build one CPU, and he takes you inside the mind of those people and of Tom West, the leader of the project, and the emptiness of life after it's finished.
And if you think of, one of our earlier stories that should be films episodes, I told the story of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan simultaneously with Mukulika Banerjee. Like one arc of the story was Mukulika goes to Pashtunistan or goes to those areas, the Pathan areas of Pakistan, and she's trying to find survivors of the Khudai Khidmatgar back in the day. And another arc of the story is, decades ago when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is on a quest of his own to defeat the British Empire and then eventually to make something of the new nation. And he succeeds in the first quest, fails in the second one. Mukulika kind of goes through her own quest of understanding why a people who are supposed to be violent Pathans could take part in the greatest non-violent movement of all time and lead the movement, with original thinking. And you must watch the episode and read her book and listen to my episode with Mukulika, of course. But again, that's a classic example of a quest, and there's another sort of archetype there, but I'll come back to that later.
You have properly programmed me. You had properly programmed me on Mukulika Banerjee, and a couple of months ago she came to the office at XKDR Forum, and like I smiled at her with an extra 1,000 watts because of all the things you told me.
Wonderful.
And what's the 5-part structure for this quest?
Let me take you through that. And it's actually kind of guessable, but it is the call. So you're sitting somewhere and then a call comes. Mukulika's PhD advisor tells her that only do a PhD if something keeps you awake at night. And that is a call, that is a birth of an idea. And then there is a journey. You make the journey, but then there's arrival and frustration. Like in her case, I guess difficulty in finding surviving members of the Khudai Khidmatgar and all of that. And then there is a final ordeal that takes place, not so much in Mukulika's case, but certainly in Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's case. I mean, the freedom movement had its, had its arc and had its low moments, and, I'm sure they're easily discoverable there. And finally, the goal. And you get the goal and the quest is kind of over.
When you said the call in the context of the quest, I remembered some things instantly. So in one of our episodes, we had talked about the story of the plutonium powered device that was to be mounted on the top of Nanda Devi, and things went terribly wrong. But I vividly recall a paragraph from that story, which is quietly, one by one, the CIA reached out to the most elite climbers of the world and said, hey dude, you want to climb Nanda Devi? All expenses paid. Just by the way, a minor detail, you're going to have to do some work for us. Similarly, I was part of a project to climb Kokankada in the Sahyadris, and I vividly remember that first day, the call, where Girish Sant, the leader of the project, sort of took me aside one evening saying, do you want to come on this? So this is a great moment, saying, come, let's go do it.
And life itself, like your life itself, right? Like at some point you've done IIT, you've done a PhD in economics in the US, and then you decide to fucking come back. I remember kids of that generation, I remember in the 80s, once you make it out, oh my God, you've escaped. India wasn't a great place in those days.
Yeah.
You made the call to come back, and the quest, of course, is make India a better place. And I guess that's ongoing, but elements of tragedy, elements of rebirth, we will talk about those two archetypes a little later.
Okay, Amit, we finished 3 out of 7, and I must say, not enough romance. Tell us about number 4.
Not enough romance. You want romance, I'll give you romance. But first, let me ask you, since you want romance, what does DDLJ stand for?
Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, a movie that I have seen.
It's one of the 20 movies you've seen. Tell me about when you saw it. What do you remember of it? What is memorable?
The last scene, the Kishi stylized slow train getting off the railway station,
apni zindagi.
and that endless slow train clanking of the railway platform. And all of us, we've done those train travels in obscure stations, so we know that feeling.
So that last scene features in a future chapter, but the film features in this chapter. This archetype is voyage and return. You make a journey and then you come back, and you come back changed, usually. So you've got examples of this like Alice in Wonderland, like Peter Pan, like The Time Machine, right? You've got Hollywood examples like Back to the Future. And many memorable Bollywood examples actually fall exactly into this. There's DDLJ, of course. Then there is Dil Chahta Hai, the trip to Goa. They make a journey, they return, and perhaps they come back changed. Jab We Met is again a journey, and momentous things happen there. Queen. So, again, a really sort of a common storytelling trope. And I guess it speaks to us in certain fundamental ways, because many people, when they watch movies like this or read stories like this, they are at a point in their lives where they might kind of feel stuck, as Thoreau famously said, living lives of quiet desperation. And they might feel kind of stuck. And it's kind of attractive to think that I could just go somewhere and something will happen, and, change will come upon me, and etc., etc. So, it's like it speaks to all of us in a fundamental way.
I think Robert McNamara has a beautiful quote around this, that we go on the journey, and when we come back, we realize where we had been. We understand where we had been.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also what you said about, you had, I think, once quoted Robert Persig, the zen you take, the zen in the mountains is the zen you take with you.
So then you find at the top of the mountain is the zen that you take with yourself.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think what a journey does is it perhaps brings that out. A journey outside is a journey inside in different ways. And there's a structure to this also.
Okay, let's do it. 5 parts.
And the 5-part structure is, 1, it begins with anticipation, and then there is initial fascination with whatever voyage you're setting out on. Then there's frustration. Then there's nightmare, like when you went on a trek and you broke your leg and you were hanging off a cliff and you thought you're going to die. And then there is escape and return. So
The Hobbit. Okay, so
yeah.
Bilbo and Frodo Baggins are going about their happy life,
Yeah.
and Gandalf comes along and says, "Hey, we're going to go do some crazy shit."
Yeah, and Lord of the Rings for that matter. Yeah, so many classic adventure stories which require you to get up, go somewhere, and
so kind of quest, but kind of journey and return, and it changes you, and
I mean,
your life is never the same again.
Yeah, I guess the voyage and return would be about that old cliche: it's a journey, not the destination. So it's not particularly what you're searching for, but the fact that you travel and you travel.
So I think The Hobbit is more in category 4, because they go out on a finite problem to slay a dragon, and they come back and they are changed. And then they are ready for the quest, which is Lord of the Rings, which is structurally different.
Absolutely.
Okay, number 5, tell us.
You wanted romance, I will give you romance. What comes with romance? What comes with romance, Ajay Shah?
Dopamine.
That's such a scientific, technical answer. I expected you to go somewhere else so I could correct you and bring you back, but you haven't gone there, you've gone there. So what comes with romance is laughter, with joy, happiness. So our 5th category is comedy. Now, what often happens is, like when I was a kid, I would see Shakespeare's plays, and they'd be classified under comedies and tragedies. And for me, the way I first understood comedy was something that makes you laugh is comedy, right? But actually, it's evolved as a genre. It's a genre where, there are misunderstandings, mistaken identities, there is much confusion, and then everything gets cleared up. And usually, you have a happy ending.
As you like it.
All of Shakespeare's comedies for that matter. And Booker talks about a particular structure to how they can unfold. Again, this is a typical structure. It doesn't necessarily apply to every kind of comedy, but this is a typical structure.
But it's absolutely not like modern stand-up comedy or something, where there is no investment of a build-up. There's a one-line setup and a punchline.
It's a story. It's not a joke.
It's got to be a story. Yeah, got it. Okay, tell us the 5-part structure.
So I'm not going to tell you a 5-part structure. That comes later. But this is essentially how Booker talks about what a comedy can look like. And over here is kind of 3 parts. And then he's going to also give talk about 4 aspects of it. And here are the 3 parts. So initially, we see a little world in which people have passed under a shadow of confusion, uncertainty, and frustration, and are shut off from one another. Then the confusion gets worse until the pressure of darkness is at its most acute and everyone is in a nightmarish tangle. Finally, with the coming to light of things not previously recognized, perceptions are dramatically changed, the shadows are dispelled, the situation is miraculously transformed, and the little world is brought together in a state of joyful reunion. Right, so this is like an old tradition where the audience sits, everybody laughs, from the early plays of Aristophanes, and you come down all the way to Shakespeare. You find it in Hollywood, and Groundhog Day, Dumb and Dumber, they all kind of like this. Bollywood's really good at comedy. We've got Golmaal, we've got Parosan, we've got Andaz Apna Apna, we've got Houseful. Again, classic comedies. There's a lot of confusion, there's shit happening, there's a little bit of conflict, but it's going to get resolved because it's a comedy, and things kind of work out, and sometimes in the middle there'll be sort of a union, and there are other elements to it that I'll get to, but this is broadly what a comedy looks and feels like.
I don't know enough about the world of literature. Does it seem to you that the presence of this kind of genre in the books of the age has declined in the 20th century? It seems to me to be older. I can't recall 20th century, or we don't take P.G. Wodehouse as serious literature.
Well, P.G. Wodehouse is one of the finest examples of it. As far as modern literature is concerned, one way to think about it is that comedy, as defined in this way, isn't always funny. For example, Booker points out that if you look at the structure of Jane Austen's books, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, it's a structure of comedy. There are misunderstandings, those misunderstandings get clear, you reach a conclusion, etc., etc. So it is that kind of structure. So comedy doesn't mean hold your stomach and laugh out loud because, hey, Kishore Kumar is saying funny things, but rather that it is that kind of structure where there is confusion and a fog gets cleared and everything kind of works out. And I think in cinema, it's still sort of active. Rom-coms can follow that kind of structure where you have misunderstandings about each other, and then that gets sorted out. So it would be common in rom-coms. Literature, I mean, I don't know, but I'm sure popular literature has a lot of it, and certainly it is going to be there in every single book brought out by the famous publisher, M&B.
Oh, okay.
What?
Mills and Boon.
Mills and Boon, not Mills and Boons, as people sometimes say. Right? So how do you refer to them in plural? If you have 30 books published by Mills and Boon, how do you refer to them?
I don't know.
30 books published by Mills and Boon. Let's continue.
What is the plural of Attorney General?
Attorneys General.
And you were going to finish on the structure of the comedy?
Yeah, so Booker also writes interestingly that there are these 4 common sort of tropes or plot lines that come up in the classic comedy, Aristophanes, Shakespeare onwards, and those are: 1. The first is that any characters who have become dark because they are imprisoned in some hard, divisive, unloving state, anger, greed, jealousy, shrewdness, disloyalty, etc., must be softened and liberated by some act of self-recognition and a change of heart. They must, in effect, become a new or different person, come to themselves, as it were. And if they do not change in this way, the only alternative, as we shall shortly see, is that they shall at least be shown up and paid out by punishment or general derision, so they can no longer cause harm to others. The second is, it may be necessary for the identity of one or more characters to be revealed in a more literal sense. They are discovered to be someone other than had been supposed. And the third is, where relevant, the characters must discover who they are meant to pair off with, their true other half, since until this is established, they seem lost and incomplete. Recognition of their other half thus becomes an essential part of discovering their complete identity. Finally, and in general, wherever there is division, separation or loss, it shall be repaired. Families shall be reunited, lost objects found, usurped kingdoms re-established. Whatever is out of place or sick must be restored. And one interesting point that Booker points out is that what has happened in the 20th century is that love and humor have sometimes gone in different directions. So you have the same structure of comedy, and back in the day, like in Shakespeare's plays, you had it play out where love and laughter went together. But now love and laughter, and there's a great book by Milan Kundera with that name, magnificent. But now love and laughter have kind of gone in different directions. So your typical rom-com may not have so much laughter, and equally your typical laugh out loud film like Bollywood's Houseful, did it have romance in it? Perhaps it did, but it wasn't central. So, so that's an interesting observation, and obviously all these tropes and genres evolve, but the archetype remains strong.
Okay, Amit, show us archetype 6.
The sixth archetype is tragedy. And one way of thinking about that is that you have your protagonist and things happen to your protagonist. Perhaps it is a noble protagonist who is sort of lured into doing ignoble things which aren't great for that person. And then eventually everything falls apart and it usually ends in death. And one could argue that this is all of life itself, because what greater nobility is there than that of a newborn baby? And all of life is a fall from grace, right? And an end in death. We have kittens screaming in the backgrounds. I don't know if our sound person, Gaurav Chintamani, brilliant man, will clean it up. I hope he doesn't, because,
What better soundtrack?
what better soundtrack when we talk about tragedy? And again, oldest, this, from Oedipus Rex to a lot of Shakespeare, Macbeth, Hamlet, Julius Caesar. And you will point out that in Julius Caesar, the tragedy is not of Julius Caesar, it is of Brutus. It is of Brutus, who is a noble person and then commits, like debases himself and suffers as a result of that. And you have this across Hollywood, across Bollywood. In Hollywood, you've got, say, Bonnie and Clyde. If you're looking at world cinema, Jules et Jim. Right? In India, you could say Devdas. Though if it is, Sanjay Leela Bhansali Devdas, I think the film itself was a tragedy. But we shall leave that aside. And again, there is a structure to this. And here's how the structure goes. There is sort of anticipation right at the start. There is a dream stage where this person may be dreaming of something, like Brutus might be thinking at this point.
Anticipation stage is like Beware the Ides of March. You're building up the atmosphere.
You're kind of building it up, and then, there's a dream stage where it seems like things will turn out right. Then there is frustration, nightmare, destruction, or death, right? And two things to note here. One is that often the star of the whole show is a person who is being corrupted and debased and is, changing. And the other really interesting point is that depending on your point of view, many stories which fit into other archetypes could actually fit into this also. Like, you think of the story of David and Goliath, right? And if you think of Goliath, if you give a backstory to Goliath, who was he? How did he become like this? What are his frustrations? Maybe because he's so big and strong, he's trapped in that image of himself. He's never found love in his life. What are the difficulties he deals with? How has the world treated him? And if you think of it in that sense, maybe the story of David and Goliath is a story of tragedy. Maybe Goliath sees the stone coming from the catapult and he chooses to let it hit him. Entirely possible, right? For my writing course, one of the exercises I give in the last week is change your point of view. So if you know a story that's been told from a particular point of view, tell it from another point of view. And, common examples that, different participants in the course have taken up at different points of time are either telling Sholay from Gabbar Singh's point of view. And some of them, have weaved a beautiful backstory, and you kind of get, and, everybody's a victim of circumstance, the world is complicated. Or, the Harry Potter story from Voldemort's point of view, right? And these are really interesting. You might, at one level, you might think of Harry Potter as white and Voldemort as black, but you could easily see shades of gray the moment you start building backstory, the moment you go a little deeper, and which would be much more realistic, because in the real world, there is no black or white.
Or the Mahabharata from Draupadi's point of view.
The Mahabharata from Draupadi's point of view, and the Mahabharata is, in a sense, such a masterpiece. Like I've spoken, like one of my favorite books of all time is Yuganta by Iravati Karve, and brilliant book of sociology. And she also talks about many aspects of the Mahabharata that don't look so good today, like the misogyny and sexism and all of that. But if you leave that aside and think of it as a product of its times, it's got all the great storytelling tropes. The reason that it survives today is not just because at some level we've associated it with religion and so on and so forth, but it's magnificent storytelling. It is so good.
It was a selection process in the oral tradition. So there were thousands of competing stories, and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Iliad and the Odyssey, these are the things that survived.
And I want to say that it's not just that there are thousands of competing stories, but there are thousands of competing Ramayanas. I think A.K. Ramanujan wrote this great essay called 300 Ramayanas, if I remember the title correctly. And what happened through the Ramayana through time is that you have the original version, but then every time it was retold contextually, given the time. So in the tribal belt, there's a telling of the Ramayana which will be completely different. So it becomes like a Rorschach test, that it reflects the mores of that society and it reflects a changing thought, and sometimes the main character will be different. So in that sense, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are particularly fascinating because they are evolving stories. It is not one story.
Or the vision that comes to my mind is a decentralized vision, that it's not a single centralizing force of one master book, but in each part of India the story is adapted and repurposed.
Thousands of years before Unix, Ajay Shah, we had an open source epic. Well done. This is our culture.
And Amit, take us to the seventh and last story type.
So, DDLJ, you remember the last scene? Ja Simran Ji Le Apni Zindagi. What happens there? What happens there to the character played by Amrish Puri? Right? He changes. He is reborn. It is a moment of rebirth,
but
in a
I
sense.
was thinking of that in the context of your comedy, that an essential feature of the comedy is that the person must find redemption, the person must change or be cast out.
No, I mean, there is change everywhere, but our seventh archetype is rebirth, where that is central to the whole thing, that someone is being born again, that they are being changed in fundamental ways. So in a sense, a story of DDLJ we discussed it in the chapter about Voyage and Return. But it is, and it has that element of comedy and mistaken identity and whatever. It could have had an element of tragedy, but the story doesn't go beyond them getting together. Maybe then later there is tragedy. But Amrish Puri, again, reborn. He actually becomes a sort of a different person in a really fundamental way. And if you look at Western examples of that, again we can go a long way back. You'll have Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Dickens's novel A Christmas Carol. The Amrish Puri character there is Scrooge, and Scrooge has a change of heart. So again, that is a kind of rebirth.
Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast is a classic example. Within Bollywood, perhaps Munna Bhai MBBS, in a manner of speaking. So again, it's a trope that kind of carries on through, where you have a situation, shit happens, conflict happens, the story moves forward, and at the end of it, the person changes in some fundamental way or the other. You could argue, in a sense, coming of age stories can also, function kind of like this.
Yeah.
Ajay, has this ever happened to you? Have you changed in fundamental ways?
I don't think so.
You've been the same person.
Yeah, in fundamental ways. Meaning lots of implementation detail has happened, but the foundations were the same.
So I want to quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn here. There's a great quote by him from the Gulag Archipelago, which Booker cites at the start of this chapter on rebirth. And it's a beautiful quote and really speaks to the complexity of the world. It was on rotting prison straw that I felt the first stirrings of good in myself. Gradually, it became clear to me that the line separating good from evil runs not between states, not between classes, and not between parties. It runs through the heart of each and every one of us and through all human hearts. This line is not stationary. It shifts and moves with the passage of the years. Even in hearts enveloped in evil, it maintains a small bridgehood of good. Gentle reader, it has started raining. We cannot control this. We are not in a studio with green screen, but this is the real world, so we'll have to rush back inside. But I wanted to end this chapter by just saying that in our stories, we necessarily have to simplify. We necessarily have to often paint in shades of black and white. Everything is filled with certainty. Shit isn't always probabilistic if you look at story structures and so on. I want to say the real world is really complicated. Let us not rush to judgment. Let us not think we are good and others are evil. Let us recognize that the line that Solzhenitsyn spoke about runs through all of us, that within all of us there are elements of comedy and tragedy, of hero and villain, of David and Goliath. So the kind of stories I would love you to tell, if you are a storyteller, is stories that embrace this complexity and do great things with it. Isn't that right? So it's time to say goodbye, gentle reader. Thank you.
Bye-bye.